Okay, we're going to get started. So your exam, what's going on with your midterm? So midterms next week. We'll start right at 11. Format is open book, so you can use a book if you have one, hard copy or digital, doesn't matter. Anything on Blackboard you can use. Your own class files, notes you can use. The internet at large you cannot use. Okay? So it will be some question and answer. I can't remember exactly. So a multiple choice section and a practical section where you will build a solution and add some functionality to it. Okay, so try to be here before 11 so that way you can get started right at 11 and give yourself the maximum amount of time to get it done. Okay, and the midterm is worth, I can't remember, so I better check.
5%. Probably 20. 25. 6. Okay.
So the midterm's worth 15%.
Oh, 15. Okay. Sorry, how much?
Sorry. Forgot my screen was frozen. 15 for the midterm.
Less than the assignment. All right.
Okay. So today we're going to do a couple of things. The first thing I want to show you is how we can use an existing project as a template for a future project. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is take our solution as we had it last week, leave it alone, but we're going to export it as a template. Then we'll make a new solution today, and then rather than starting with a blank canvas, we can pick our template from last week's solution. So this is a great idea. If, let's say, you're going to build something like a content management system, you can create that as a template, and then if you're going to build out multiple sites, you can just keep picking that CMS template, or you're building a shopping cart. So create a generic one, save it as a template, and then every time you want to make a new project, you can base it on that solution, so you don't have to start from scratch. Okay? So if you want to fire up Visual Studio and open up your project from last week, we'll make a template from it, and then we'll make a new solution today from that template. No, but it's on Git. So you can download it. You can download mine from GitHub if you want. If you download from GitHub, keep in mind you're going to have to change the web.config file. Obviously, it has my connection string. I've marked everybody's assignments. By and large, they were quite well done. I think the class average out of 28 was 23.5 out of 28, which was good. There were a couple of people who I didn't get an assignment from. I'm not quite sure why, but that's a pretty big chunk of your mark there, that 20%. And that assignment was due last week. So if you have your solution from last week, you can open it up, and if not, you can take my repository from Git. Links right here in Lesson 5. So just grab my COMP2007 Lesson 5 Wednesday. So you can just download that as a zip file and extract it and open it up. Okay. Or you can clone it and then open in Visual Studio. Sorry? Nope, you want the Lesson 5 Wednesday. Yeah. So the solution file, I called it, if you're taking mine, it's COMP2007 Lesson 5 Wednesday. If you're working with your own, it's called whatever you called it last week.
Just last week's.
So I'm not going to run the solution. What I'm going to do is export it as a template. They made this pretty idiot-proof. File, export template. So we've got the choice to export the entire project, or we might just want to export a particular item, so a particular class, particular page that we want to reuse. So I'll just keep the default project template and choose next. So I'll just call this, I'm just going to call it COMP2007 Wednesday, so that'll be my template. You can put a description in, but you don't have to. And if I leave this checked, automatically import the template into Visual Studio, what this will do, every time we go to create a new project, this will now appear in the list of project templates we can pick. And here's the default location. We can change where the templates get saved, but that's the default location. My Documents, Visual Studio 2013, my exported templates. And it'll export it as a zip file, which we can leave it in that format. We don't have to extract it. So I'll just click Finish. And now it's created a small zip file in my exported template. So we can leave it alone. We shouldn't have to do anything else with it. Is this deja vu? Didn't you already walk in here with your bag and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to close the solution. And I'm going to make a new solution, but rather than choosing a blank solution, here's how we'll use our template. So we'll click on File, and New Project. And ordinarily, we've been going, up until now every week, we've gone to Visual C#, and in web, we've been picking ASP.NET Web Application. This time, we're just going to choose Visual C#. ASP.NET Web Application is still in the list, but if you scroll to the bottom, you're now going to see your template with the template name that you created. So I'm going to call this one click File, New Project, pick Visual C#, but don't pick Web. And down at the bottom you should see the name of your template. So now it's going to build a new solution, but it will basically pull all of the items we had in Lesson 5 into the solution. So if I go to my Explorer here, all my pages are here. So courses, departments, as well as everything that Entity Framework built out for us is here.
This is technically going to be Lesson 6. Yes.
This will technically and officially be Lesson 6, yes. Now, there's a couple things we're going to change in here. The first one is if you grabbed my repository, if you grab the code from GitHub, it's got my credentials in web.config for my Azure connection. So you're going to have to change those. Okay. If you're worked from your own, then you'll have your connection string from last week. So I'm just going to go in here and actually I've already got my password, which is good. We are going to make one other change. Everybody, whether you're using your own or not, we are going to change something else in web.config. Last week when I used Entity Framework to generate my models, and we used the database first functionality, we used the default name and it created a connection string and it called it COMP2007 entities. So it was basically the name of our database with entities stuck on the end of it. I actually want to change this. In a few weeks, when we get into using authentication and security with .NET, there's a built-in package called ASP.NET Identity, and it will use look for a connection string that has the name default connection. So what I'm actually going to do, for today we could leave this as COMP2007 entities, but I know moving forward in a few weeks we're going to want that connection string to be called default connection. So I'm actually going to change that, the name of my connection string in web.config. So I'm going to change that to default connection. Now that's going to break some of our code that's using that connection string, so we're also going to have to then replace the instances of COMP2007 entities through the project. Now we could just do a find and replace. So call it default connection, camel case. It's actually not case sensitive, but with no spaces, because this means we can use this connection already when we incorporate the ASP.NET Identity package in here. We won't be doing that for a few weeks yet.
You just renamed it, haven't you?
I renamed it, so if I compile now, I'm going to get some errors because our pages that we've already built, our students' pages, are using. Okay, maybe we're not going to get an error. It's news to me. Let's go in here and see. Oh, okay. Sorry, we do need to change it here though, I think. Here we need our connection string. So this has to be changed. Pretty sure we're going to have to change it here to default connection. So this is in our model context class. You'll find that file under models, expand the model. It's down, sorry. Yeah, or you can do find and replace right here. So models under the EDMX and under context model.context.tt. I don't know.
Google. We have to change the public name too then?
I think it stands for text transform, I'm guessing, but I'm not sure. Sorry, Ben, do we have to change which?
You see how like it says public COMP2007 entities?
No, because that's just the name of the class. We can keep the name of the class, but this is the connection string that our database class is using.
It just kind of get confusing when you get set up.
I'll maybe put in a comment here. Oops.
Because doesn't it automatically create this code? Or?
It does, but I think it looks for this should be the connection string. Anyway, you know what? We'll find out. We'll run it and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to start without debugging. And I should still be able to get my list of students. I'll just undo that change so we can see, without me changing that to default connection, what would happen. So if I just put this back how it was, oops, I have a feeling this will blow it up. So that value refers to the name of our connection in our connection string. So when we used the wizard, when we used the Entity Framework wizard to generate the model, it gave us a name. It said it was going to call the connection string COMP2000 entities. So if I was going to build this again from the beginning, I would override that and change it to be called default connection. Then it would have coded that right in here from the beginning. So this name refers to the connection string in web.config. It's not critical that you change this for today, but I'm going to do it because I'm going to want it this way moving forward. So just make sure that if you do change your connection string, run your application, make sure that it loads and your student's page is still working. So last week, basically, we had the create and read functionality working here.
Getting a parser error. It says it doesn't inherit
Yeah, mine too.
system.web.ui.page. No, it's using the template exactly the same as the other project.
Okay, you know what the likely problem is? If you get that error that says, so the class doesn't inherit system.web.ui.page, did you by any chance name your page with a capital S in Solution Explorer?
No, Sam, I think it's because we copy pasted those pages, remember? Something was in there.
Yeah, but it worked fine in the last solution.
Did you build your solution
Yeah.
today?
Yeah, I just rebuilt it.
So what we want to do today, oh gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We were worried you were swept away in a tornado.
It was close.
There was. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to add delete and edit functionality on here. So the first thing we want to do is add delete functionality to the grid. We want to add a column on the end that says delete. You could make it a button. I'm just going to use a link, and then we can invoke the delete straight from the grid. We also should include some kind of confirmation, so we can just use a simple Jquery script that'll handle that for us. So if you can open up your students.aspx page. So we're going to need to add a fifth column to the grid. So in this case, what we actually want is called a command field. So we'll set up the header text to say delete. And we've got a property here called the delete text.
Wow.
So what text will invoke a delete command? And we'll also set the show delete button to true. That's pretty simple.
It's like Unreal. PHP and HTML, it's just like.
So this won't be fully functional, but if we refresh the page now, we should at least get that fifth column with the delete link. So we've got links. They say delete. Now, you can change the type of, you can change this from a link to a button if you want. I prefer to use links. If you want it to be a button,
Yes.
then you choose button type equals, so you can make it a button, an image, or a link. The default is link, so I'm just going to leave that attribute out
That's actually just
and use it as a link.
Is there a way to apply the CSS class to that button?
Sure.
Just do class, environment candidate.
If you want to apply a class, it's control style CSS class is the attribute you would set. So the control that appears in that column, or this would have that class applied to it. So I'm just going to leave it this way. Now there are a couple properties of the grid we need to set in order to invoke the delete. This just kind of sets up the interface, but we have to wire up the grid a couple other ways. We need to set an event handler on the grid. It has a built-in event handlers. So on row deleting, so I'm going to choose that one from the list, equals, and we'll create a new event, and Visual Studio will write the row deleting event handler for us in the code behind. Now, there is another property we're going to set. We don't really need to set it in this case, but it's a good idea if we're going to allow deletes from the grid. We do have the student ID, which we're going to need, right? We're going to need to know the primary key field so we can uniquely identify the record we're going to delete. The grid has a property called data key names. In effect, we can set one or more fields to be keys in the grid, just like a key in a table. We don't typically need to set more than one. Usually if we have a primary key field somewhere in the grid, we're just going to use that column, that value, to be our key field. So I'm going to set the data key names. It is a collection. We can use more than one. In all the years I've used ASP grid views and data grids, I've never set more than one key field on one grid. I've never really seen the need to. So we'll just set student ID. So this has to match the database column. This is, I can't just make up any name I want. It's got to be one of the actual fields that we're binding to the grid. It's got to be the key field. Not case sensitive. None of this stuff is case sensitive. And you notice when we used Visual Studio to generate the row deleting, you can see we now have unsaved changes in our code behind. There's a star here because it wrote the event handler for us, just like when we clicked on the buttons. We get a row delete. So we won't see any visual changes from this. If I run the page right now, I'm going to get an error. Can anybody tell me why we're going to get an error if I just load my page right now?
Method on row deleting, grid students row deleting doesn't exist.
Right, it's here, but if I refresh my page, my grid is now looking for that method,
That's a big file.
but I haven't rebuilt. So that method isn't added to the DLL until I recompile. Build, refresh, error should go away. So nothing's going to happen yet. So this performs a post back. And you'll notice as I move over the links, you can actually see down here in the status bar, you can see the index. It's not the ID that gets passed, but it's the index of which row I clicked. So 0, it says at the very end, delete $0, 1, 2, 3, etc. as I scroll down. So we're going to use the index. So we have to go through a few steps in order to do the deletion. First, we have to interpret what row the user clicked on. Okay, so we'll use that index, which is an argument that gets passed to our delete handler. So we know which row they clicked in, which doesn't necessarily correspond to an ID, right? So then we have to use that index from the grid. This is where our data key will become important. We're going to use that index. We have to find the key value for that row, and then we can find that record and use Entity Framework to do the delete. And then we can refresh the grid. So first, we'll kind of break this down into steps. Store which row was clicked. So I'll just create an integer called selected row. And in here, notice our event handler that got all the event handlers, they always have two arguments. The object, so what is the actual object on the page that invoked the event? And E represents any arguments that were passed to the method, any additional arguments. So in this case, the argument that's being passed is the index on the grid, which row the user clicked. So that's represented by this parameter name E. So if we want to see the properties of E, which of these do you suppose, which property will tell us which row the user clicked on? Yeah, so E.rowIndex, that'll tell us which row starting at 0 the user clicked on. So then we'll want to get the selected student ID. Using the grid's data key collection. So I'll create another variable called student ID. And we're going to have to use our selected row as well as the data key property of the grid in order to figure out what the student ID is of the record the user clicked on. Oops. Sorry. That's not quite right. Bear with me for just a second as I'm confusing myself. No, hang on. Data keys. Okay, so it wants to know the data key at what row. So we want to use our selected row. And because potentially we can have more than one data key, we have to specify it by name, or we can use the index. So find the key called student ID in the row the user clicked on. Now we're getting an error here. What? Yeah, it's just that data key just returns an object. It's not typed. So we're going to have to do a type conversion. So we're going to have to convert that value to an INT32. So first we figure out what row they clicked on, then we're identifying the key value called student key in that row. So now we're going to need to use Entity Framework to find that object and remove it. So we'll use our entity class. So this is our context that we called COMP2007 entities last week. So we'll instantiate a new connection. So now we need to find that object, and then we can remove it.
You have a bracket in the row.
Which bracket is in
That
the,
one should go on the ending using.
right, thank you. I'll just be consistent with my variable names for what we did last week. Okay, student S. So we'll create a student variable. So here's the link syntax to find the student based on that ID. So we'll use our student model and we'll pass in a where clause. So this is going to look new. It's going to be a bit different. Actually, let's hang on. Sorry. I'm going to use a different name.
Yeah.
Okay.
These are just variables I'm creating. So we're going to create a variable of type student. So S and OBJS are just variable names I'm making up to represent the student. Okay. We're connecting to our database. We're using our student's model. We're passing in the student ID that we got from the grid in our where clause. The first or default means basically find one record, limits the query to finding one record, or default just means if we don't find a match, don't crash if we get a null back. We can say dot first, but that will crash if no record is returned. First or default will prevent an error.
So it'll just return a dummy?
Sorry?
What would the default be?
Well, it will basically return null values back, but it won't give us an error. If we use first and our query doesn't find anything, we'll get an error, which we may or may not want. In this case, I don't want it.
Go ahead and pass a type in there.
You do use that.
Please. Environment Canada has lifted their severe thunderstorm watch
Okay.
for the Barrie area. A tornado watch remains in effect as conditions for severe thunderstorms, which could produce tornadoes, remains favorable. Please remain alert for developing weather throughout the day. Thank you.
We would say tornadoes that can produce thunderstorms over this thunderstorm.
So now we'll use our database connection. We'll use our student's model. What method do we need to call here? So what do we want to do with that collection? There's no delete method. So scroll through the list. You got it, Zifa. So we want to call remove, and remove takes a parameter. We need to pass in an instance of a student object. So which variable represents the student that we've, yeah, we're just going to use our variable S. So we got the ID, we created a student object and populated it based on the ID, then we're going to remove it, and lastly we just call db.saveChanges. So pass the object we want to remove to entity framework, call remove, and call save changes. We should do one other thing. So after save changes is called, that record should be removed from SQL Server. What should we do after we do the deletion? We could, actually, when we use the using statement, that will basically handle it for us. This object, it only lives until here. Well, we're already on here, actually. We're already on this page, but we want to refresh the grid, so what method will populate the grid? We wrote a method. Yeah, we'll just make another call to our function we wrote last week that queries the database again, populates and binds the grid. So we'll refresh the grid. So we'll just call get students. So we don't have to, we could redirect, leave the page and come back to it, or we can stay on the page and just refresh our grid. It's probably more efficient that way. Now what I suggest before you try this out, try adding a few new students first. Let's leave the students that are in the original script I gave you, because there's related data attached to most of those records. So don't delete the ones that came in the script. Add a few records of your own and test. We'll make sure delete works. Then we better add the JavaScript confirmation to them.
Yes, this is the one that I wrote for me.
So I'm going to go and add a couple of student records.
Actually, I like it. Actually, I can click it. Oh, I like your button. That's CSS class button. Danger button. So you just click it.
So if I go to delete,
Button, danger.
my record's gone, my grid just reloads.
My highlight is different than yours. Well, actually, oh yeah, it's totally doing it. Like front on, it looks like you're in white. The side looks like really. Yeah, the side, not mine.
What does the error say and where is it? And by the way, the steps we went through to create the template, I've put those steps on Blackboard. So if you want to create a Visual Studio template from an existing project in future, the steps are here inside of Lesson 6. So here's a little jQuery script. Basically what it does, when the document loads, it will look for any anchor tags, and if the text inside the anchor tag says delete, it'll attach this same confirmation that we used last year with PHP. Now, this will only work if you've used a link button. If, as some of you have changed the type, it won't generate an A, so you'll have to change the script here. Where it says A, you'll need to change that to say input, because it's generating an HTML input tag instead if you've used a push button. So as long as you've used the push button and the text says delete, you can change that A that I've highlighted to input and it'll work. Now where should we put this script, do you think? Where would it make sense to put this?
Bottom body.
You're both right. Should go at the bottom. And Brad, why should we put it on the master page?
So it's on anything that has a delete?
Right, because we're going to build out this application. When we build out the departments and build out the courses and enrollments, we can use this same script. So easier to put it on the master page. So I'm going to copy that script. If you want to change the message, you can. So I'm going to open up my site.master. And where exactly, I have to put it somewhere very specific. Sam, you said the end of the body. We already have two JavaScript links at the bottom of the body. Where should this script go in relation to those two? Why does it have to go after jQuery?
It uses the jQuery libraries.
You got it, because if we put it before the jQuery library, the jQuery in the script won't run. Okay, so it has to go after. So I'll put in jQuery delete confirmation
Yeah,
must go after.
so it's like you put the value of that tag.
Hang on just a second. So it reads the, yeah, it will, if it's a button, if it's an input,
Yeah.
then what it will evaluate is the value,
Okay.
but the inner HTML should still work, should still give you the value. So if you've used a push button, you've got to change where I have the A tag on line 44, that'll have to say input instead. If you've used a link button, you can just use the script as is. Now it is a bit generic because we're not specifying what record they're deleting. We're not providing a student name or a department name, but I think this is sufficient. If you want to specify those things, then you'll have to put this script on every page and customize the message.
Did you not just overwrite the script in the actual page that you were trying to run? Would it overwrite the master?
No. We're joining with it.
No. If you left it in the master and you also put it on the page, you'd get two confirmations when the user clicked. Both events would fire.
You don't, that document.ready, you don't need that.
Yes.
It's only for putting it at the beginning.
Yes, we could remove that. So I'm going to add another student record. Again, try not to delete the original ones that were here. So now I can save. And if I click delete now, we get our little jQuery confirmation. If I click OK, now it's gone.
Is there like a CSS class for your frame or something like that?
Sorry?
The frame that came up there, is there like a CSS class you have there? Or is it just Firefox?
That's just every browser. Basically, the browser renders those boxes.
Oh, right, okay.
So they'll look different, slightly different in each browser. Every browser will have its own implementation of a JavaScript alert box, a confirmation box, etc. You can change it, but you can only change it so much. Some of it is sort of baked into the browser.
Didn't work for the input tag.
It didn't work for the input tag. I'm gonna try changing mine, and we'll see with the input.
Like it says input type button value delete.
Maybe you have to do input and then square brackets type is equal to button.
I will try it this way. If I say so now I've got a button. So it may not be the inner HTML.
It sucks this next week. Exam week. Yeah, you got next week.
We get a pass on our.
I will have to think about what we'll need to do if you're using a button. You used input or button?
Oh, I
tried input.
Oh. We'll have to play around with that a bit more if you're using a button. So we're 3/4 of the way there. We've got create working, we can read records, we can delete all of these things using Entity Framework. So the last thing that we want to do is we need to get update working. Just like with another language like PHP, doing updates a bit more involved than doing. It's the most complicated of the three, right? Because we've got to first do a query, look up our record, and then save changes. Question?
Like when we select for delete two, it's not getting my student ID very good.
So nothing's being deleted?
Yeah, that's like nothing is going to be getting from the delete view.
Okay. Make sure you have the data key name, and it has to be student ID with no spaces. It's not case sensitive. You have that? Okay. And in here, in your code, you also have student ID this way. I'm going to show you, because a few of you have had that issue. If you're deleting and nothing seems to be happening, here's the best way to debug it. The Visual Studio Debugger is your friend. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, start my debugger, I'll add a new record, and then I'll delete it, and I can walk through it with a breakpoint. So I have a new record. So now when I click delete, and I say yes, now it starts walking in here. So before this line executes, student ID is 0. Now it shows me a student ID.
It was showing the date, record date.
Okay.
So like it was fetching the grid view.
It was giving you the grid view index and not the ID. So now when I connect and run our link query with that ID, now it shows me that I have something in my student object, right? I can see all the properties this way.
And then after this, like it's showing two grid views. The middle column is showing delete, and then after that is one grid view right, one grid view is left.
Still doing that? Okay, I'll come have a look in a minute. Okay. So using the debugger, when things don't work the way you expect them to work, the first thing to do is put a breakpoint at the start of your method and walk through so you can try to evaluate what's happening. So looking at the time, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up our grid. Oops. Oh, I think I just closed my solution. Awesome. So what we want to do is add an edit column. We'll put it between the enrollment date and the delete column. And we want that page to have links that will take the user to the student page so they can make changes. So let's open the ASPX file back up in the HTML view. So before my delete column, I'm going to add a different type. We've got 4 bound columns. We've got 1 command field. So what we want here, now we have a couple of options. You can actually do editing right within the grid itself. I personally am not a big fan of it for a couple reasons. One, basically the user can click on a row, and where we see static text, those will get turned into text boxes or drop downs or check boxes. Some people like that, keeping it all on one page. There's a few problems with it. The first one is your grid suddenly tends to get very wide and becomes, people have to often scroll across to see, which isn't generally a good idea. The second thing is if we have validation rules, we need to add validators to inside of our grid to make sure, for example, they don't leave a required field blank or put in the wrong data type. The other thing is we already have a form that has all the inputs and all the validators we need on it. So I would prefer just to use that for editing rather than doing it inside the grid. If you want to do it inside the grid, it's not wrong. I generally don't recommend it. It kind of makes for a messy interface, in my opinion. So if you choose a command field, you have the ability to make it an editable right inside the grid. We're just going to use a hyperlink field instead. And we have to set up a bunch of properties on this field. So the first thing we'll have to set up is the header text, which I'll just set to edit. The text will say edit, so that's what I want my links to say. We have to set up the href that will where those links are going to go to. There is no href property because it's a server control. The property we're going to set is the navigate URL. At runtime, that'll get rendered to an href. So we want to load student.aspx. The same form we're using for adding, we'll make it a dual purpose form. We'll use it for editing as well. Let me take out that, make the path relative. So we could run it this way, and this will set up links to student.aspx. This will work, although it's right. It's just going to give us a blank page. So if I reload, I get an edit grid. It takes me here. So what else are we going to have to do on those links? Yep, so that's what we're going to have to do on this page. We'll have to populate it. So what else will we need to do with our hyperlink column?
Grab the student ID.
Right, we're going to have to append the student ID on and format the link. So we're going to have to create a key and value, a query string, key value pair to go on the end of those links. So now when our student page loads, we can pull the ID out of the URL and then query the database, get the first name, last name, enrollment date, and populate our form.
Does that do the get or post? Or is it like totally?
It will be like a get, but we don't, just like we didn't use post when we saved, we don't actually need to use that. Right, where's our student page? We didn't actually have to use post, right? Because of view state, our form controls are sticky, so we just read the values out of the form controls. Really. We will need to use the request object in order to interpret the query string. Instead of get, we'll use the request object. Be similar to using a get. So we've got to set up a few more properties of our hyperlink field so that we can append the student IDs on. And the property names for this are really goofy and super long. I don't know why. So the first property we've got to set up is the, what is it? I think it's the data navigate URL fields. So this is a collection of values that we're going to append on to the end of our links. So we're only appending one value on here. We could append multiple values. So we're just going to append on the student ID. So take that data field. And yes, how we spell this matters. This has to match one of our database column names. And here's my favorite property of all time.
Literally, or?
Yes, the data navigate URL format string.
Okay, nice.
All right.
That looks like a midterm exam question right there.
What is your favorite?
No.
So this is where we basically create a template for the entire link. So what page, so sorry. What page are we going to? We're going to student.aspx. We're going to create a key called, I'll put this on another line, it's so long. Student ID equals, and this 0 represents the first and only item in this collection.
Can you believe it? That is, you'll actually do that thing.
So let's say we also wanted to pass on the last name. We'd do it this way. So we'd have last name here, and then we'd have to format our string this way. Right. If we wanted multiple values on the links, we'd have 2 fields in this collection and 2 key value pairs in the format string. I'm only going to pass the ID, and we'll look up the last name along with the first name and enrollment date using Entity Framework.
This is where you're talking about for the SEO.
Yeah, so we're doing this in a basically a not, we're not really writing out friendly URLs in this case. But this would be something we might consider overriding. In an application like this, it doesn't matter, because this wouldn't be a public application, right? In a few weeks, we're going to put this all behind a login screen. This is private. But if the pages were public, then yes, we might want to reconsider how we format those links in terms of making those friendlier. Yeah, we'd use a slash instead, and instead of putting in the IDs, we'd be putting in the friendly names instead.
So if you wanted to pass last name, would you have to include the last name field inside of data nav?
Yes, just how I had it a minute ago. You'd need comma last name, and then you'd need to append on this way. So this should give us the right format for the links. So it takes us to our page, and now it builds a query string with our key and value. Now we'll still have to code this page because it's showing blank. So we'll have to do 2 things here. We're going to have to add some code when this page runs to determine are we adding and giving the user a blank form? Are we editing and giving the user a pre-populated page? Then we're also going to have to write similar logic on the click of our save button, because right now when we click save, it just adds a new record every time. So obviously we're going to need to know, are we running add or are we running update? So when we come back, I think we'll take a pause here. When we come back, we'll add the logic to populate the form. Then we'll add the logic to do the save, and then I will give you lab 2. Okay, so we'll come back in about 20 minutes. Okay, I'll come have a look.